Hi, welcome to the Right on Crime podcast. I'm Ross Jackson. I'm a policy analyst with Right on Crime at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Elizabeth Henneke, the founder and CEO of the Lone Star Justice Alliance and one of the most prominent voices in juvenile justice in Texas. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth. Let's dig into one of our priorities for this session, which is an affirmative defense for victims of human trafficking. Elizabeth, could you start by talking about your background and how you got involved in this space?
Absolutely. And Ross, thanks for having me. This is really fun. I have represented children for it makes me feel old, about 2 decades. And one of the things that we have discovered in representing kids is that oftentimes they end up in the youth justice system because they themselves are victims. So do you mind if I tell you a story?
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. So one of the things that happened is here in Texas, I got a phone call about a then 14-year-old kid who had been convicted of a crime in Bell County, and a wonderful student reporter had just determined that this kid had been transferred into the adult prison system at the age of 16. Wow. Automatically, that worries me. I ended up meeting with her and finding out that she had been convicted of the crime of her sex trafficker, who had actually held her in confinement for more than 2 years. That launched me on a path to ask, how is that possible? How can children who have been sex trafficked, held in confinement, in bondage, having their body sold, get convicted of the crimes of their abuser? And thank goodness to the Right on Crime, we're here today because we're going to do something about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story, and we appreciate all the work you've done as an attorney and as an advocate in this space. So your organization has labeled this work as Mercy for Survivors. Could you explain what inspired that title?
Absolutely. Mercy for Survivors really reflects ours, and I think it's a shared belief, that justice acknowledges the role that coercion and exploitation can have on kids and adults, and that ultimately we believe in mercy, that it really is about grace and mercy defining how we treat our survivors. I want to be clear because this is something that gets misconstrued. Survivors still have a role of accountability, meaning there are roles that they play and there should be accountability. But if you believe in a injustice, then mercy is sometimes entitled, especially if they've been coerced or forced to commit a crime.
Absolutely. And unfortunately for us, there's not a ton of data in this space on how many victims of human trafficking have been incarcerated. So how do we know that this is such a big issue?
Absolutely. So while official data, you're right, is scarce, and I know this is something you and I have both talked about.
Yes.
Studies like that by Shared Hope International and actually the University of Texas's Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault document the extensive accounts of survivors' criminalization. What these studies and what my own personal experience has shown is that the depth of trauma that can come from survivors often leads them to be involved in the criminal justice system. And ironically, arrest can often open up the entire story of what's actually happening behind the scenes. Wow. So for instance, in my client who was 14 at the time, you would hope that when arresting officers approached her, they would ask her, why are you in a hotel room with a 38-year-old man? Yeah. Right? Unfortunately, that often is the first time. So what we know is that anecdotes play a large role, but these are anecdotes that have been documented nationally, extensively, even by Governor Abbott's own child sex trafficking team, who have documented accounts like this. Ultimately, we're listening to the survivors themselves.
Absolutely. So could you explain what exactly an affirmative defense is and like how that's going to help victims of human trafficking?
Absolutely. So an affirmative defense it's really interesting. I mentioned earlier about accountability. The way that an affirmative defense works is that a prosecutor is going to come forward and make a charge saying a negative criminal act has been committed. And then an affirmative defense encourages a victim to then say, wait, let me explain the circumstances around that offense. Yes. Let me come forward and tell you, law enforcement officer, what was really going. The burden is on the defendant to prove by preponderance of evidence whether or not someone has had coercion play a role. They have to prove these circumstances in a court of law. But then an affirmative defense is, at the end of the day, an ability for the court to grant mercy to them. Absolutely. And again, another callback to why we call it the Mercy for Survivors Bill.
Yeah. So this doesn't just automatically excuse someone from the crimes they've committed. There's still a system of accountability. We're still acknowledging what they've done, but we're also allowing them to share their stories with us and how they got to that point and why this crime was committed.
That's exactly right. And, Ross, we've talked about this. It's so interesting. This whole thing came about because the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals in a case called Moreno. I know we both read that case. In Moreno, the court was really struggling with what to do about this history of abuse. The entire trauma that had led someone to be really easily influenced and have their will overcome by another human. And ultimately, they thought that the law as it currently sits doesn't allow for the introduction of this evidence. It only allows for the introduction of evidence within a short time frame right before the offense occurred. But we know that trauma, that abuse can occur over years.
Yes.
My 14-year-old kid convicted of the crime of their abuser, we had to hear about the fact that she was sold by her grandfather into sex by the time of 3. Which caused her to be easily influenced by future individuals who by the time of 11 were selling her again.
Wow.
That history of trauma, of the way that her mind responded to coercion, I think we both agree is highly relevant.
Yes. And
the affirmative defense is the pathway by which she can introduce that evidence into a court of law.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we're trying to hit on here. And I'd like to explore the history of this defense a little bit. So are there existing protections for human trafficking survivors?
So there's not great ones. So what we know is there have been states that have done things like vacatur, which allows you to sort of overcome a prior conviction. In Texas, because of this case of Emory Moreno, trafficking survivors really don't have a path to make that relevant in their courts of law. And that's very concerning because if we believe in a fair and just system, prosecutors and judges need to understand the circumstances. But without an affirmative defense, what incentive is there to tell the horrors of what you've been through? Right? And so what we have is I'll talk to survivors, especially child survivors, who say, I didn't think it was important. Why would I share what happened to me? Why would I recount the moments that I was held in bondage or the rapes that occurred? Instead, I'm encouraged to keep my mouth shut. So the affirmative defense is relatively new. It's being brought by those of us who believe that trauma and that circumstances should be brought into the court of law.
Very good. So how has this draft of this proposal evolved over time? I know we've talked a little bit about changing the definition of duress, and now it's kind of evolved into this human trafficking specific defense. How has that journey been?
It's been a long journey, I'll tell you. Originally what we did, we drafted the definition of duress to be a little bit broader as a whole duress defense. So the affirmative defense of duress just says if you're coerced or threatened, you should be, if a reasonable person would have felt coerced, then that becomes relevant. So we looked to Arizona, and that was a partnership I know we did together. We looked at the Arizona statute, and it had been in place, and it said, well, the reasonable person with the history of abuse and trauma became the question. I think in general, prosecutors felt like that was a little bit too broad, that it would apply to anyone who had trauma in their past. And they really wanted to focus on this unique population of those who had been trafficked. And I think we understood that concern. And so we narrowed it to be a standalone affirmative defense that would be available only to survivors of human trafficking.
Yeah. And we know other states, you mentioned Arizona has this duress statute as well, but some states have shifted to creating their own human trafficking affirmative defense as well. And we know that some red states like Wyoming and Oklahoma have done this. Oklahoma being very broad, they can apply it to a multitude of crimes. It's not really limited in any sort of way. So Why is it so important that Texas's defense be broad like this as well?
Well, first of all, I got to commend Right on Crime, because my understanding is that y'all played an important role in Oklahoma with the Survivors Justice Act. And I think that it's an example of policy that leads with compassion and justice, offering relief for a wide range of nonviolent offenses and other offenses. And I think it demonstrates a real move that we should move forward in Texas. So Texas can learn from our partners.
Yep.
It can learn that when we open up to a trauma-informed justice system that recognizes the role of victimhood in criminality, that it works. And I'm so proud of what Oklahoma has done. I'm so thrilled to watch Right on Crime lead in this area, and excited for my home state to continue that work, because what I know, and again, the governor's work with the child sex trafficking team has just been some of the best in the entire country. Yes. I know that my state believes in compassion. I know that it believes in mercy, and I think it understands deeply the role that trafficking has played in our communities. So I'm excited for Texas to join Oklahoma. I'm excited for it to join and lead with other red states who are moving forward on this issue.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank you for all your work that you've done in this space and partnering with us and other human trafficking advocate groups. And we are very hopeful that we'll get something done this session, and we'll keep pushing forward and session after session, making sure that human trafficking victims are afforded the protections that they deserve in our court system.
Well, and thank you, Ross. And I know that since you've joined personally, I just want to give a shout out to you that I have seen such a deep understanding expressed in this work. And the leadership that y'all have provided is critical to the success of this bill. And I hear often from survivors how important your leadership has been. So thank you, Ross, and thank you, Right on Crime, for all that y'all have done.
We appreciate it. Thank you for joining us today.
Appreciate you.
Thank you for joining us at Right on Crime Podcast today. To follow and hear more stories just like this, go to rightoncrime.com.